practicing backwards is specifically for memorizing music. So if you feel like you have an awesome memory, then this video probably isn't for you. But if you're anything like me, you're not naturally that good at memorizing pieces. And you might see other people who memorize pieces really quickly and think to yourself, well, how do they do it? What can I do to memorize pieces like them? And that's where practicing backwards comes in. So when I was at university, there was nothing I hated more than getting ready to go on stage and thinking to myself, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember this piece. I'm not sure if I'm going to stuff up halfway through and I'm going to have a memory lapse. And I remember always having this feeling before I went on stage. And there was this one piece I was learning. It was Prokofiev Sonata No. 7. And I desperately wanted to learn that piece. But it was really crazy and there were like a whole bunch of different key changes and there was like, it felt like there was no tonal center throughout the piece. And so I found it really difficult to learn. And when I was on stage, backstage, getting ready to go and play that piece, I was freaking out. And this wasn't like normal nerves. This was like, I really don't think I can do this. And I never ever wanted that feeling again. And so when I finished that performance, it was a little bit of a disaster. And I started thinking to myself, how can I practice in such a way that I always know what's coming up next? How can I practice in such a way that I always know what's coming up next? So when I practice, I take breaks every now and then. And I remember one day taking a break and I used to go and sit on this hill and underneath this tree on the hill. And I'd sit there with my legs crossed and meditate. I was kind of a bit of a weirdo. Anyway, I'd sit there and close my eyes and this question was spinning and spinning and spinning in my head. How do I practice in such a way that I always know what's coming up next? And then the answer hit me. It was so obvious. I had to practice backwards. If you practice backwards, you always know what's coming up next. Okay, if you start at the back of the piece and make your way forwards, then you always know what is coming up next. Now, when I'm talking about practicing backwards, I am not talking about note for note, okay? That would be silly, that doesn't make sense. If you play note for note backwards, then really you're just practicing a completely different piece. No, I'm talking about grabbing sections of music, practicing them normally, and then going backwards this way, like that, yeah? Alright, so that's what I actually mean by practicing backwards. But why does it work so well? Why does practicing backwards help us to memorize better than practicing forwards? Well, it's actually really logical and it's got to do with what's fresh in your mind. So the best way to demonstrate this is to just rattle off 10 words to you. So I'm going to say 10 words to you, all right? Ready? Camera, phone, chicken, egg, lettuce, tomato, towel, chair, war, dirt. Now, what is fresh in your mind? What's fresh in your mind from those words is probably dirt, okay? It might not be, but chances are dirt is what's fresh in your mind because it's the last word that I said. So why is this important? Well, let's relate it back to music. So this is some music that we're learning. All right, there's the music, and that is the end of the piece. Well, we're going to call this section here section C. This is going to be B, and of course, this section here is going to be section A. Now, if you practice section C first, then section C is fresh in your mind, okay? That's important. Section C is fresh in your mind. So now when we start practicing section B, it's easy to move on to section C because it's fresh in our mind, okay? So let me just explain that one more time. If you do section C first, then when you practice B, you know what's coming up next because C is fresh in your mind. So when you practice backwards, you're practicing knowing what comes next. So if you practice knowing what comes next, then in a performance, you're probably going to know what comes next, right? It actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So now that we've practiced section B, if we go on to section A, section B is fresh in our mind, okay? So now when we practice section A, it's easy to connect that to section B. That is why practicing backwards makes so much sense. Now, how do we do this? What's the best way to practice backwards? I'm actually going to use my iPad to explain this because I think it's going to be a little bit easier to understand if we use a real piece. So let's dive into the iPad. So here we have the end of Chopin's Etude Opus 10 number 5. This is also known as the Black Keys Etude. But anyway, let's dive in. Step number 1 is we're going to ask ourselves the question, how much can I fit in my head in the next 2 to 5 minutes? So I'm just going to write here 2 minutes to 5 minutes, okay? So you figure out how much you think you can fit in your head in the next 2 to 5 minutes, and then we're going to draw a bracket around it. All right? So let's just say that it's just this much here. You just want to work on that, those octaves going down and that little bit at the end. So you go, all right, I think I can fit that in my head in the next 2 to 5 minutes. You put a bracket around it, and then you practice that, okay? So notice we're at the end of the piece here. We practice that, and we get that from memory about 3 times. So once you can play that about 3 times from memory, you then move backwards. So then we ask ourselves a question again. How much can I fit in my head in the next 2 to 5 minutes? So how much can I memorize in the next 2 to 5 minutes? And you put a bracket around it. All right, so I put a bracket around it like that. And now I practice this bit of music and a little bit of the next bar as well, just so I'm getting used to going through to the next bar, okay? So once I can play that from memory about 3 times, then I go back and do the exact same thing again. How much can I fit in my head in the next 2 to 5 minutes? And in this case, it might be that much. Okay. By the way, if this is looking a little bit difficult for you and you're thinking, oh my goodness, there's no way I could learn this piece, that's totally fine. We're all at different levels here. Anyway, so then we practice this and we do that from memory about 3 times, and then we move back and we keep practicing this way. Okay, so I'm just going to go over again why this works. When you practice this, it's fresh in your brain. In fact, I'm even going to draw a little brain here for you. There we go. That is my impression of a brain. So, if you imagine that this is like the front of your brain here, then once you've practiced this 3 times from memory, then it's sitting there at the front of your brain. It's really fresh in your brain. So that when you then practice this part here, it's easy to then practice the next bit as well, yeah? And while you're practicing that, you've constantly got this little section here at the forefront of your mind, okay? So you always know what's coming up next, okay? That's the key. You always know what's coming up next, okay? And step number 2 is just to do this the next day. So we practice this every single day. All right, and if you want to learn a little bit more about this way of practicing using brackets, then click on the link attached to this video, because I do a whole bunch of free stuff around this technique. And there's something that I call the bracket technique, which is kind of the core of how I think people should be learning new pieces of piano, especially if they have difficulty learning new pieces. All right, so that's how you practice backwards, and that's why it's effective, because it means that you always know what's coming up next. So there you have it, guys and girls, practicing the piano backwards. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful for you. If you want more stuff like this, then click on the link attached to this video and I'll see you on the other side.